On the second Sunday in the season of Lent, the three readings may be summarized in two words, and the first of these words is hope, and the second is fulfillment. In the first reading, which is taken from the book of Genesis, we hear about the promise of hope that God made to Abraham. The name Abraham means God is my father. And that was the name of the later Abraham before he became Abraham, or the father of a multitude, because that is what Abraham means. So Abraham is aged. Abraham is landless. Abraham is, in a word, hopeless. And the Lord appears to this aged, landless, and hopeless Abraham and tells him that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. In this hopelessness, God tells him that his land will be much further than the eye can see. And Abraham makes a reflection. Abraham makes a meditation. How is it possible that I, an aged and landless man, will have progeny and land? But Abraham believes in the promise of the Lord, and because Abraham moved away from hopelessness to hope, he became the father of a multitude through his new name, Abraham, and he became a person who owned land further than the eye could see. The promises of God are promises which always and every time are fulfilled, and the Lord was faithful to the promise made to Abraham. The Lord was true to the promise made to Abraham, who became from a person who was aged to a person who could become a father, and from a person who was landless to own land further than he ever imagined. In the gospel text of today, we are given hope, even in the midst of hopelessness, because we encounter Jesus on the mountain at the scene of Transfiguration. In the Gospel of Matthew, after Jesus has spoken to his disciples, he takes them up to the mountain, and in front of their eyes, he is transfigured. And even as he is transfigured, two Old Testament figures, Moses and Elijah, appear with him. A variety of explanations have been given why these two Old Testament figures were chosen to appear with Jesus. Moses, some say, represents the Torah or the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. And so in Jesus, through the appearance of Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophets, the law and the prophets are being summarized. But it seems that the more important reason why these two figures appear is because in tradition they were considered not to have died but remaining with God. In Deuteronomy, we are told that Moses died, but his burial place is not known, and Elijah was taken up by God in a chariot of fire. So in tradition, both Moses and Elijah were regarded as figures who never really died, but who continued to live and to be with God. And that seems to be the reason why these two figures appear with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Matthew and Mark do not give us what they were discussing, but Luke tells us in his gospel that they were talking about the departure, that is, the departure from this world to go to God, that they were talking about. In other words, they were discussing even as Jesus was being transfigured, that he was to suffer, he was to be crucified, he was to die, he was to be laid in the tomb, and he was to rise again. In other words, Jesus is much greater than Moses and Elijah. Elijah was merely taken up by God. The burial place of Moses is not known. Jesus will go even further. He will dare to die on the cross. He will dare to be laid in a tomb, and because he hopes, because he believes, his hope will be fulfilled in the fact that he will rise again. So the transfiguration is on the one hand a glimpse of what is going to happen in a few days to the Lord. He is going to be rejected. He is going to be subjected to torture. He is going to be condemned and crucified. And on the other hand, it gives us a glimpse into the future after the death. If this is how the Lord will be already in his earthly body, we can only imagine, if we can, how resplendent the Lord will be in his heavenly body. And so, the transfiguration is an event which asks us to reflect both on the coming passion of the Lord, on his going to his death willingly, on his being unafraid to follow the will of the Father because of the hope that the Father gives him, and because he knows that the Father's promises, like in the case of Abraham who became Abraham, will always be fulfilled. There are times in our lives when things are going so well, when everything is falling and going according to plan. And at those times, it is like our own transfiguration. It is that we also feel like Jesus on that mountain, that God is on our side, and that the Old Testament figures are walking with us and talking with us and discussing with us, and we can really see the presence of God tangibly and really. But there are times in our lives when we too have to undergo subjection to ridicule. There are times in our lives when we too have to be condemned. There are times in our lives when we too carry our crosses. At those times, it is not so easy to see that God is on our side. When our plans go awry, it is not so easy to believe that God cares for us and that God will be true to his promise. But the transfiguration is inviting us to this reflection, to know that God is present when we are transfigured and on our mountains of transfiguration, but God is also present in our passion, in our condemnation, and when we are carrying our cross. Our job is to continue to be like Abraham, is to continue to be even more than Abraham, like Jesus, and to hope and to believe and to know that with God, the promises are always fulfilled. When things do not go the way you want them to go, when there seems to be no light at the end of the tunnel, when you are tempted to throw in the towel, when you are tempted to throw your hands up in despair, will you know that the Lord has been transfigured, the Lord had been crucified and laid in a tomb, and the Lord rose again.